That's
Good morning,
okay.
everyone. I'm Vallabi, the convener for this workshop on behalf of the collective Curating for Culture. Before we get started, may I please request you all to ensure that your devices are on mute, your WhatsApp tab on the browser is closed, and any electronic devices around you are on silent or no sound mode. These sessions are being recorded and screenshots will be taken for documentation and dissemination purposes. Hope we have your consent for the same. If it is convenient for you, we request that the participants may keep their videos on during the session for making it interactive. Also, to avoid any disturbance during the talk on Google Meet, I'll be sharing a Google Doc link where you can put in your thoughts and questions.
I'm not so keen on the formal introduction, which I can always read out and everybody's read it. But I think how I came to know of Sarita is, I mean, it's like the opening for me in Bangalore. We were a part of the same conference on oral histories, and Sarita was actually there with, it's the puppeteers, right, whom you were working with at that time, if I remember correctly. I don't
Yes.
remember the community though, the name of the
Okay.
community.
Okay. Which conference was this now?
The
Maybe.
oral history conference at Shrishti.
Yeah.
Those
Could
were
have
the
been.
puppeteers from Karnataka, right?
Yeah.
And I think that session was very interesting. It was not really about just listening to you or to them, but actually interacting with them in spite of the language barrier. And I thought that kind of an approach to cultural situations, because they were there to tell about how the craft has got affected and how they are adapting and reimagining the whole act of performance and puppeteering. And since then, yes, there have been many occasions where I have been introduced to Sarita's work, both as a curator, also as a researcher and a designer. Last I heard you at NCBS, and there it was
Yeah.
very interesting. The way I got to see the back end, the process of the kind of work you do, which sort of clicked when we were thinking about this workshop, where here are aspiring archivists, if I call them so, and how do you communicate, as we were talking on the phone? We are not all going to visualize it ourselves, but how do we still communicate our design to a larger audience, or the archival project to a larger audience? And we approached Sarita, and she agreed. She has a practice which is more than, I think, 15 years now,
30.
in 30, oh sorry, more than 30 years in curation, design, and I don't know, all different fronts, exhibitions, and Sarita's been also an educator at Shishti and NID recently. So she's also been inspiring more of the younger generation. And we hope that this exercise and this interaction pushes us into one direction where we can take the projects to a space of public engagement as well. Thank you, Sarita, for accepting our invitation and spending time to uh, carve out this entire exercise for us. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Ishita, and Vallabi as well. Um, Ishita has given you a bit of a background about me. I run a consultancy called Hano, and the little icon that you see on the screen is a little Hano. Hano is the name of an elephant that I met on one particular, actually, archival project at NCBS. That's the National Center for Biological Sciences here. And I will be showing a few slides of that particular project for you to sort of see. So Hano is an elephant from the 16th century who was sent to Rome, a gift of the King Ferdinand to the Pope, and he lived very many a happy few years in Rome, till he possibly died of not getting his favorite bananas or whatever else. We're not very sure. But ever since I sort of met that elephant, I kind of had a poignant connection to it, and that's how the name came about. So at HANO, we do a few different things. We do have a few projects that have to do with research and documentation. Often these are sort of self-driven. I will be speaking of a few of them. They are to do with visual culture, folk culture, and sometimes to do with typography and graphic design, which I have a degree in graphic design from NID, and then much later in museum studies from Leicester in the UK. So these are a few of the projects that I've worked on, and I've realized that, and I think I got into archive, projects that had to do with the archives and history, not in a very conscious way, but I think I sort of meandered into it. I seem to have had always an interest in things that are to do with the archives. And I think that probably went way back when I used to visit my grandparents at home in Kerala. And my interest was really to go up to the attic and look through their old papers. And I'm sure they didn't really appreciate it, but look through all sorts of old sort of things in the attic. And I think it was something that was innate. And I'm sure that's so for a lot of you who are involved in this space. So a lot of my communication and professional work in communication design and graphic design sort of ended up being a lot to do with the archives, and one sort of project led to the other. It wasn't as deliberate. Maybe in the last 5 years it's been a bit more deliberate, but before that it wasn't. And I will show a few of these projects, a few glimpses of a few slides of some of these projects. Maybe one of them I'll elaborate a little bit more. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is called Such Treasure and Rich Merchandise. It was to do with looking at 5 books from the 15th to the 18th century, 5 books, European books that had to do with the wealth of Malabar and the transfer of the Malabar botanical knowledge to the West through these 5 books. So what we had done, and the project started with Annama Spudich, who's based in Stanford, and she had wanted initially, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process of these projects as much as the content of these projects, because I think as practitioners you might be interested in that, in how these things came to realization. I think that might be of interest to some of you. So what had happened is that the director of NCBS had sort of said, why don't you meet with Annama? She's interested to do something. And she approached me and said, I've done this small thing in Stanford and we just need to do about 4 or 5 panels. And then I looked at some of the content that she was sharing and I went deeper into the content and I said, Anna, this will, 5 panels or 3 panels are not going to do anything for the content you got. They're wonderful. So let's try and push it further. And it took us about a year of convincing an institute such as NCBS to sort of house the exhibition, because it was to do with botanical knowledge and not really to do with, say, biology, which is what the institute was about. Why would they be interested to sort of house a project like this? I can get into details of that later. But so the name came from a sort of a phrase in the book, which I was quite charmed by, because what it's referring to is the treasure and the rich merchandise that is available in India as no other place in the world could afford. And, there was this sense that India had this wealth of knowledge, and there was a sort of respect and that was given at that point, which over the years or over the centuries had changed. It was a sort of iconic phrase and I wanted to use it, and that's why we called it that. These are sort of images of drop downs that we had used in the exhibition. So the project ended up as an exhibition at NCBS. It was there for about 4 months, and then now it is housed at the Museum of Natural History at Mysore. So this is an image from the archives from one of the books, which is of a banyan tree, and it is, of course, the fig tree, and it's sort of talking about the fig tree as a tree of knowledge, and John Milton spoke about it and things like that. So what we did was that the main entrance to the exhibition, as well as to the building, has this sort of installation where you can actually walk through these panels the same way in which you could actually walk through an actual fig tree. So you can weave in and out of it. That's Hano, the elephant that I spoke about. And what we did was to sort of take a lot of pages from these books, and of course they were sort of spread out across the institute, a huge part in the gardens. And what we did was we also created a garden out of the plants that were featured in the books. So that garden is still sort of functional today, a good 12 years later, actually. 2008 was the exhibition. And we sort of connected the actual plants to the information from the books. But we also connected, and I think this is important, how does one make archives relevant to today? We connected also information on the plants to sort of current medical knowledge, which is looking at these plants, at the single molecule sort of derivatives from these plants that are used for medical uses. We had a little catalog as well, along with the exhibition. And we also had a lot of sort of other things, such as literature and poems that we found that were connected to this whole idea of sort of looking to the East, and particularly to India, as sort of a land of knowledge, but also of things like spices and stuff like that. This is an early project that I worked with Indira Chaudhary, who herself works a lot with archives and history. And this was, I think, an iconic project for both, sort of a landmark project for both her and me, because I worked very, very closely with her on her content, which is the archives that she had collected on Homi J. Bhabha, who is a scientist. For those of you not from India and might not be familiar with him, he was a sort of a scientist who eventually became the head of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay. And what she had was a lot of archival material. And I worked very closely with her to sort of curate this into a sort of publication in a manner that would make the content accessible. There were parts in which the archival content was difficult to sort of comprehend unless it had an interpretation with it. And that's where our role of sort of either juxtaposing the archival material alongside something that would aid the understanding of the actual material. So things like letters between Bhabha and scientists from abroad, Nobel Prize winners, Einstein, things like that. We would contextualize it. And then also how we actually classified it and put it into sort of buckets. For instance, we had sort of every chapter would start with something like a quote that would help to, again, work as a sort of foreshadowing device to help reveal the content within that. These are some of the archival images. There were a few more, and I wish I had shown one more, which shows how we showed the letters. For instance, the letters, some of them were too long to be presented in this manner, so we didn't actually present them as is, but sometimes sort of typed it out and presented it as sort of written or reinterpreted content. This one is, well, it's not strictly an archival project, so to speak, but it's a book that we did with Wipro Sustainability Department. And they just said, we'd like a book on the history of sustainability. And it's primarily for people within our organization, but also anyone who's interested. So what we did was, again, dip through a lot of, and we did a lot of research, converted a lot of the content into manner that would be of relevance to people who are reading it today. So that means that we sometimes created infographics and things like that. It's a small little booklet, and we looked at, and again, our role was sort of to curate the content, bucket it into sort of ways in which they could then be easily digestible, and sort of core concepts were collated together again so that people could relate to it rather than just go straight into details. I mean, you know, when you throw a lot of details to people, it gets difficult for them to sort of interpret it. And we, as curators, had this role of sort of putting them into sort of broad conceptual themes that help to navigate through the information. So, for instance, we did a lot of other, you know, little things such as, I am imagining most of you know about the Chipko movement that was in, you know, was a sort of happened in Uttaranchal, or the north, in the lower Himalayas, and a bunch of villagers, especially women, hugged trees in order to stop the felling of the trees by forest officials. And so we thought that was an interesting story, and rather than say pull out archival data or newspaper articles, we thought we'd actually take the liberty of not fictionalizing it, but at least visualizing it as a graphic piece. These are sort of these are images from the same book, and it's got a page from Walden Pond, from Thoru's on Walden Pond notebooks. So again, we take the liberty of sort of taking archival material and interpreting it in a manner that would be accessible. Or even a quote. I wonder if any of you, most of you know what this image is. Anyone can sort of type if they want to, but it's an image of moonrise, which was taken from Apollo, and it was very, very significant, and actually it's a very, very key image for the sustainability movement, because it remained something that was so iconic, because it showed the earth in all its sort of vulnerability, but also in all its beauty. And again, rather than take the photo, though we have used the image as is, the photograph as is in the book, we thought it would be interesting to sort of juxtapose it with something, a quote that is sort of almost Gandhian, in saying that, you know, all we need to live on this earth is just what we need. We don't need much more than that. And so we have, as I've said, taken a few liberties when we've worked with archival images, which are iconic as this, in order to make them sort of a little bit more direct or accessible. This was a book that we did on, it's a commemorative book, so on a very, very interesting institute based in Andhra Pradesh in India, and it was of it was 25 years in their existence, and they wanted something to sort of commemorate that, and then we created this book where we dipped into, yes, their archives, but also looked at where they are and how they have sort of remained true to their vision right from the start. And their vision was that so that all should see. It's an institute that was to do with ensuring that they could provide sight to as many people as possible. And we were very, very sort of, I remember being quite sort of struck by one of the data points that they looked at, which is to say that out of 4 people who are blind, 3 people can be given sight very easily. And that was what triggered them very, very early in their days of sort of their early foundational days. And I thought that that statistic was something that I wanted to interpret. So we kind of use this device of 4 circles that are in the book, and out of 4 of the circles, 3 are sort of cut out and you can see through, and 1 of them is black, sort of in a sense saying that 3 out of 4 people can be given sight very easily. And that line is threaded entirely through the book, so that all may see. We again interpreted a lot of their data. For instance, they had something called a pyramid of trust, and we kind of looked at how they actually function as an organization. This is another book which I work a lot with Godrej Archives. In fact, I'm involved in another project right now with them. And this was a book on the history of the typewriter in India, and it came about because Godrej had just closed the last typewriter factory in the world, and they wanted something to commemorate that. And they have, as an organization, had a lot of sort of archival material, yes, but they also wanted to go beyond what was within their archives, but also look at how the typewriter in India, how it sort of changed lives, how it changed the lives of women who came into the workplace, how it was looked at in offices, how it's used even today. So it's a sort of a combination of archival material, but also sort of very, very current knowledge. The title again was something that I found in a letter, and that was the way in which people used to sign off 50 odd years back in a typewritten letter. It was very, very formal with great truth and regard. And I thought that that was an appropriate sort of title for the book as well, because it was actually Godrej presenting the story of the Indian typewriter with great truth and regard. And this image is again taken from an archival sort of document, but we sort of redrew it in order to sort of make it appropriate for the cover. And these are some of the images from the book, some images that are from the archives, their archives, or from any institutions that were using typewriters anywhere in India. That's an image actually from a film which has Helen, the sort of dancer from Bollywood, dancing on a typewriter, and we thought, why not? We decided to actually put a sort of a carbon or an image of a carbon paper in the book itself, and it looks as though it's actually but it's actually printed. Again, because a lot of people today have never even seen a carbon paper or what it does. But we did little tricks where you think that your hands are getting smudged with the carbon paper because the next page has got these smudges and thumbprints, and you think you've done it, but it actually isn't. And the images on the top are actually visualizations of pangrams. Pangrams are sort of sentences which have all 24 letters of the English alphabet, but they're sort of presented there as without the actual written text. So there are little games that you find in the book. So you look at this, and then you have to turn all the way to the back to know what that pangram is, because it's got this little number and a key at the back. So the book itself is a sort of a very interactive book. It's not just something that you read, but you sort of interact with it in various ways. These are images of a typewriter impression, like a print impression. And then quotes like this, Zindagi ki har kahani likhta hai, which is actually a quote from the film that I was speaking about, which that the typewriter does this. And we created these sort of curatorial sort of notes to help to hold the content together, because they were a bunch of articles from various people, and it was sort of difficult to collate all that without some sort of binding curatorial notes. So we had 4 or 5 of these across the book, which held it together. This is not really an archival project, but in a sense, it is to do with the story of pastoralism in India, which is, pastoralists are nomads who have animals. And this is a little graphic novel that I had worked on, where I looked at, well, in a sense, I looked at sort of old, films, as well as papers and even research books that had to do with pastoralism. And this was commissioned because a group, an NGO, was working on an exhibition at Delhi, and they wanted me to do a graphic novel, or actually they just told me to do a beginner's book on pastoralism. And I decided to sort of do a graphic novel. So here I take 4 characters, and these 4 characters are actually not real characters, but they're people I met again in some of these papers that I read or films that I had seen about this. And I said that, okay, let me sort of semi-fictionalize them. But by semi-fictionalizing, I was able to sort of tell the story, which was talking about really the sort of problems that pastoralists face across India, but linking them together. I had a really good illustrator helping me with these. So once I wrote the script out, his drawings were so good, I was able to remove a lot of the script because his drawings were evoking what we wanted to say. That's how the name of the book came, A World Without a Roof. Okay, this is a sort of a self-driven project, and I've taken it to some extent, but not entirely. I got an intern to sort of work with me on doing some research, and I realized that when I was in Bangalore, I studied mostly in the north, but when I came to Bangalore, I realized that a lot of my history was very based on what was from North India. And also I realized that there were very few stories of women in history that I knew of from South India. So we just sort of decided to do this research and see where it goes. And it actually started from this little block that I found in Avenue Road, which is this marketplace in Bangalore. And it's and I was very curious when I saw it, and I asked another Bangalorean, what is this? And she said, oh, well, this is Rani Chinnamma from North Bangalore, and I had no idea who she was. So then that's what sort of triggered this research. So we did a bit of sort of looking in and did further sort of digging around. And then I thought, these were women who were very, very inspirational. So why not sort of talk about them? Isn't it something that, generations today would like to know? And so we did things like booklets and stuff like that. But then an opportunity came when there was a festival in Bangalore called the Unbox Festival. And they said, why don't you do something? And then I said, why not do something like this, where we actually talk about these women and look at the stories that are there and share it with a group of participants, and use something like a workshop where you're actually talking through the information that is there in history. So I collaborate quite often with this lady on the left. Her name is Bess Frimodig, and we work on various sort of projects together just because we like to do things together, really. But she's a sort of very accomplished printmaker. And so what we did was we presented this to people who were participants in the workshop, the information that was there. And then we had a short sort of print workshop where we would break people into groups, and they could then talk about what these stories meant to them, or, to their personal sort of experiences, or the experiences of people that they were close to. And what it did was it triggered a lot of conversation, and I thought that was really something. And then they would sort of create these sort of postcards that they would send out. I mean, that was the aim, that we created this format where they could create postcards that would speak to the women across time. This is the main project that I wanted to speak about. How much time do we have, Ishita?
We have about 10 minutes more. That should be fine.
Mm-hmm. That should be fine. So, yeah, this is the main project that I thought would be of interest to all of you. This is an exhibition on Godrej, on the history of Godrej, but told through the archives. And this exhibition was put together, initially at least, for a corporate archive seminar that was being held in Bombay. And so it was done in a bit of a hurry, but now it stays there in its permanent form. Though we hadn't intended it to have such a sort of long life. It was done in 2017, I think. And it's used for people who come in to understand how archives can be made more alive, but also, of course, people who want to know a little bit more about the history of Godrej. It's a very, very small space that we had, and I was already fairly familiar with the Godrej archives before we started doing this. The archives team in Godrej is small, but very, very tightly run by Vrinda Pathare, and it's a wealth of knowledge that's actually there. And what we found was that there were two ways of sort of talking about, it isn't a corporate exhibition. We were very clear from the start, and I insisted that to make it sort of different, we must say that this is a story told through the archives. That was the primary sort of theme. So here we've got an image which is the sort of the beginning of the exhibition, and we took images that were there from advertisements. We actually looked at fonts that were used in older advertisements, used that to create our sort of title for the exhibition. And we got a painter to actually come in and paint this. We didn't want something that was just digitally printed, and he actually came in and painted this space. And there are a few things that are key to how we approach this exhibition. One was that I decided that the curator's role should be sort of a little bit take a bit of a backseat, and every visitor should be able to sort of curate their own experience that they wanted to. So the whole purpose, therefore, was to use whatever means we could in order to make sure that visitors could decide how they want to access content. And the reason for that, I thought, the reason for that was because it was important that people, because there was so much content, there's something about locks that Godrej did, there was so much. And you're going to be overwhelmed, but I might be more interested in, say, the typewriter, or someone else might be interested in how Godrej worked with employees, or what was their relationship with the environment that they were in. So you could then choose what you wanted to do it. And that was really the way in which the approach in which the communication and the exhibition is handled. I'm just going to share a little bit of a video. Tell me if you can't see it. Okay. Not working. So what you saw really is Brinda, the chief archivist, and she's sort of presenting this little installation that we did, which is, so Godrej makes safes, and the wheel that is used here is actually a wheel from one of their safes. And when you turn the wheel, you come across one or the other of value of Godrej. So for instance, their belief in, say, quality or in sustainability or whatever else. And then when you turn that wheel, you can actually pull out the archival material that is concurrent with that particular value. So for instance, something on, say, sustainability, and you'll pull up a lot of the content there. So you can actually choose what you want to see. And then we also sort of had access to a lot of film. So there was a big corporate film that they found very early in their sort of archiving history. And now the film's sort of long, so what we did was we sort of broke it up into little parts, and the part which has got to do with the locks is actually next to an installation which has got this sort of little box of all the various locks that they've produced over the last 100 odd years. So Godrej is at a site which is, it's a very large site, and we, anyone in Bombay will say Vikhroli, and that's Godrej. There are factories that are spread out across acres and acres, and each factory had its own little history. So how does one, and someone would be, say, attached to the lock factory, and today the lock factory has become some other factory and things like that. So we decided to sort of condense this entire space of 20,000 sort of acres into a little 800 square foot space, and created a sort of like a platform, and on that platform, and all these little things are what we call stations, verticals that come out, and each of these sort of numbers are actually specific sort of factory units. And what we did was, a lot of the content was hidden or kept in these little tablets, and you could access these tablets, and you could you could actually physically walk towards an archive, and you feel as though you're walking in that space. So what happened in a lot of times is that someone, say, standing on factory number 19 would look up at factory 17 and say, "Wo pehle ye tha," or "I used to be there." And so it's a sort of physical and an immersive way of making people relate to the archives by actually getting a sense of being in the space. It's sort of it's bodily to be able to sort of do that. What it, of course, allowed us to do, these sort of digital devices, is to sort of feed in so much more content than is physically possible in a small sort of space, by sort of putting a lot of the content online. I wonder if anyone knows what this object is. Ishita, could I ask people to sort of make a guess? And if people already know because of having seen this presentation before, don't talk. Anyone wants to hazard?
Yes, please.
Ishita, you know, but the others. Anyone wants to? Okay, so somewhere. Okay.
Locker.
Yeah, so someone.
Oh,
she was. If she was privy to it from earlier, she's not allowed to have said it. But anyhow, it's revealed. So But, you know, most people, I sort of share this. Some are not fair. But yeah, so this, you know, this little box that you see, it's a sort of a drab box. And the thing is that a lot of archival material that you might come across sometimes can be very drab. And it's only the sort of stories that actually make them interesting. So how do you make something that is of importance and of relevance? How do you sort of give life to it? And how do you sort of give life to objects or people from the archives in a manner that make them come alive? How do you relate? So in the actual exhibit, at the exhibit, we showed a little film, which is from the films division, and it actually brings
the answer is elections. Through elections, our entire adult population can choose its representatives to form the government.
So, you know, just a little clip like that suddenly makes you look at an object that looks, you know, rusty and old, and something that you might actually walk away from if you see it in an exhibit. Now, again, getting back to this idea of telling the story through the archives, which was something that we kind of kept insisting that we do, was partly because when speaking with Vrinda and the other people, there were, you know, I would sort of say, okay, so how did you come across this particular thing? And then they'd say, oh, you know, somebody called us and someone told us that there's this dabba somewhere and we should go there. And then we went there. Or I was in a conference in London and somebody asked me, spoke to me and said that, you know, my father used to work with Godrej. Can you help me? And then, you know, the story goes of how Vrinda comes back and she looked up this person's name and finds out this person's father's story. And then she's able to share that information. So there were lots of little gems that we found, which were very, very interesting. And I thought it was important, therefore, to sort of tell the story of the archivist as well. So there are these 4 or 5 stories that we, 5 stories that we selected, some that had to do with how, about the excitement of discovering something in the archive, something else of how an archive, how archives can be relevant to people today, such as the girl whose father was in London and wanted to know about her father's stint at Godrej, and similar sort of stories. So we kind of created these little graphic panels, and you can actually turn these panels and turn them around and then see the actual archival material that are related to the content. And we, again, dramatized it. I mean, as you can see now that I kind of play a little fast and easy with content, and I'm quite comfortable to sort of take content and then sort of reinterpret it or fictionalize it as is necessary. So we kind of dramatized a little bit and even had a bit of Indiana Jones-like sort of search embedded into the way in which an archivist works. And then the other thing was that other than physical objects, you know, things that are to do with, say, print or even moving films and stuff like that, I thought it, you know, there's something to, and I remember this because when I was, again, young and would visit my grandparents in Kerala, my aunts would come and hug me, and there was this distinct smell, you know, because they had that synthol smell, you know, and I, you know, those are sort of such strong triggers. So we thought, let's bottle that smell. So we actually got the team at Godrej to actually bottle this little thing, and so people who come in can actually smell a little bit of what it was like those days, the sort of perfumes of those days. And we actually recreated some of the soaps. So the soaps divisions actually made the soaps the way in which was made then, and we printed packaging and gave it to people who were there. There are a few more images which unfortunately I seem to have missed out. But for instance, we actually had a film view, a little booth, which was again recreated on one of the sort of mechanical cylinders that are from one of their engineering departments, where you can actually sit there and watch. So, it was really ways in which we could sort of look at objects from history, but bring them alive in various different ways. And you can still go and see the exhibition if you're interested. You could let me know and I could tell Brinda to give you a pass to go and visit it. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, please go ahead and ask me. Or if you want to go back to any particular image or story, I could help.
Thank you so much, Sarita, for taking us through this wide range of works. But in the meanwhile, Avni, do you want to start?
Hi, Sarita. It was wonderful looking at all your projects. I think when you were talking about the NCBS project, and you mentioned about taking a year to convince them to take up the subject. So I think my question is that when you have to convince other involved parties about whether it is because you think that a certain subject is relevant for that particular institution to take up, or about sponsoring a project, or why you think a certain partnership is significant, what do you think are the keys to pitching and convincing people, and what are the kind of challenges that come up?
One is, I think, if you have to be convinced to start with. I think that's a sort of very key thing. And that's something that, if you have a sense of conviction that this is something that really deserves to be presented in whatever way else, then you have the armor with you to sort of go ahead and convince. Now, particularly in this case, for instance, no institute, especially an institute which is sort of semi-government, has ever done something like an exhibition of that nature. By today's standards, the budget wasn't much, but at that point it was. And particularly, there was no precedent to sort of justify the sort of having an exhibition of that nature at all. We were lucky in the sense that I was able to sort of convince the director at that point, he himself, but he was also very, very clear that it wasn't enough that he should be convinced. The entire sort of, the scientists at that point were very key, very, very involved in every sort of decision making at NCBS. So they said everyone should be convinced. So one was that I think what turned in our favor in doing this project was that they saw it as an opportunity to sort of brand the Institute as an organization that was looking at issues that were not sort of just narrow or within their labs, but at something that was broader. And there was a sense of sort of belonging to or participating in issues that were current at that point in terms of sort of discussions on herbal knowledge, was sort of general knowledge. And they felt that they could therefore talk to the people outside of their own community and their own peers and speak of the relevance of things like science and stuff like that. So understanding that, and because I think from my background of sort of understanding what institutes or organizations see themselves as a brand, suddenly NCBS became an organization that was sort of interested beyond just the sort of science that they did. They were seen as an organization that wanted to speak to the community that they belong to, the larger community of Bangalore and other things. They opened up a lot of things that had conversations that were to do with the arts and stuff like that. Soon after that, they started sort of the lecture series that had to do with not just, scientists, but other things. So people started coming in, and I think core to them was that the Department of Science and Technology from Delhi, he came down specifically, the secretary of the Department of Biotechnology, he came down specifically and saw this. And I imagine that probably helped them to sort of influence budgetary and policy sort of matters, and I think that the director at that point did see the potential of something like that happening. And also in the worldwide sort of scientific community, because this was linked to a seminar that happened where they had 400 participants from all over the world, started seeing the institute as something that was not, and often institutes in India have a label of being ridden by bureaucracy or sort of things like that. So this helped to break a lot of these sort of notions. I don't know if that answers my question, but your question, sorry.
Yeah, but it gives me an idea of how you went about it, and it helps.
It was. I'm sort of telling you about what happened as a result of it, but I'm not telling you about the sort of arguments that we made in that case. What we did do, of course, was I made a lot of presentations. Like literally, I kept pulling out things from this and sort of presenting it to. And I still remember an afternoon where Anna and I were in this boardroom at NCBS, and we just spread out everything onto the boardroom, and these scientists just came in and looked at it and said, okay, and some of them were okay, some of them were not, but yeah, I think it was a gamble for them as well, because there was nothing of that nature being done at that point.
And the other question that I had was, all the work that you shared are books or physical installations, which of course make it very appealing and interactive. What if these things were to be done on a digital platform? Would they have shortcomings, or would it still be good enough to showcase?
Well, I will be able to answer that maybe in a couple of months, because I'm actually involved in something right now, again with Godrej Archive, something that we will in all probability be revealing in January. So please look out for information on it. And there, while the content was something that I've been working on for about 5 years or so, and we had these grand plans of making a sort of a book and an exhibition and stuff like that. But given the nature of the world today, a huge amount of it will be digital. It will not probably have the same impact as a sort of visiting an actual space, but it will have more reach, I imagine. So it's a sort of different approach. There's a certain tactility to certain things, especially archival objects. Seeing an object or an old document can trigger things because of their very sensorial and tactile nature, or like I said, smells and stuff like that. So those are things that I imagine digital will be limited. And in fact, I had given a talk a while back on the digital, isn't it just another tool? So the talk that I'd given was called Just Another Tool, the use of the digital in sort of museums and stuff like that. The talk is there somewhere or the other. But, and I presented the Godrej exhibition because we use so many aspects of using the archives, putting up the archives in various digital spaces. But I kind of end with saying that the things that people remember is things, are seeing things or smelling things or touching them and things like that, or experiencing them and things like that. So in the end, it is just another tool. We can't sort of think of it as a be all and end all, I'm sure. I don't know. Can you give a little bit of introduction to you as you go along, the people who are speaking?
Yeah, sure. Sure. I'm Avni, and so Tana Trivedi on the cohort and we are doing the project on the Patni family archives.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Kamal has a question. Kamal?
Hey, my name is Kamal. I'm doing a project on a relative of mine who's was involved in a political movement. My question was actually, this is what I wrote. I said, how do you come up with your visuals or graphics or typography? And I said they're beautifully designed. Is it the story and then visuals, or vice versa? Do you think of the audience when thinking of visuals, or what's appropriate for the story at hand?
I think it's a combination of both, because you know, I mean, when we study design, or the form that a visual takes influences the content as well to a very large extent. So for instance, if you're using a sort of a particular graphic style, that will be read as much as what you're saying in that piece. So for instance, and you sometimes will use visuals as a contrast. So for instance, in the exhibition project, the Godrej exhibition project, we had a certain language which was talking about the history of Godrej, but we sort of switched the language when we were talking about the story of the archivists. We used a sort of comic book narrative, even though the story itself is to do with the archives. We decided to actually use a graphic narrative style. One, to create a contrast. Two, to sort of say that we have fictionalized it. This little bit is fictional, or semi-fictional at least, because we sort of took liberties of dramatizing things. Very little, actually, we dramatized, because a lot of them were already fairly sort of dramatic in itself. So, but yeah, so I think that it's a combination of responding to the content. Now, for instance, in the case of the pastoral book, I did deliberate a lot on what the style should be, even in terms of the format. It's not just the graphic look, but even the format, because the brief I was given was that we just need a little introduction to pastoralists for mostly young people, but anyone else as well. Now, we could have used a much more sort of current graphic language, which is a little bit more edgy and things like that. But now I felt that would take away from something that is core to the pastoralist's life. So we didn't want to create a graphic style that was very, very strong visually, that would take away from the content. So the style is sort of a bit more of a natural illustrative style. The colors are sort of muted, you know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Okay, over to Kamal. Sorry, Johan.
Just want to appreciate the visual language as well. I really love the colors, and I mean, you worked with many different artists as well, so it was really beautiful to see the archive coming alive. One of the questions I wanted to ask, or just get some context, is the language. I mean, as we are working with our projects as well, we are asked to think about target audiences, or who we are kind of looking into. So I'm also not too familiar with whom the Godrej Archives was primarily targeting, and I noticed that even the books and the exhibitions were primarily in English. Were there alternative ways to kind of engage with the material? Just wanted to get a bit of understanding of that.
So in the Godrej Archives exhibition, I forgot to sort of mention that we have a lot of oral histories as well, which are there as recordings in those sort of verticals, if you remember the image of the stations.
Yes.
So a lot of the oral history recordings were in Marathi or Hindi. So you could sort of listen to them in the vernacular, for instance. The pastoral book, I was very, very keen actually to get it translated, because I think it would have been important to have something like that in some form or the other, maybe not in a book form, whatever form, in a language that families of pastoralists could also read, or people who are more closely sort of in connection with them could read in some way, or read or listen to in some way. So that's something that the NGO that I work with are keen to do, but well, we haven't yet address that. But yeah, I think the vernacular, that's something that is a challenge often, I feel. How does one sort of have, say, and especially in a country like India where there's so much in terms of language diversity, and how does one address all that in a particular space? Yeah.
I mean, we all know there isn't one answer. Just wanted to.
Yeah. No, I know. It's an issue that's there. You're the one who's doing something on typography.
Yes, correct. So I was also fascinated to see your aspect as well, because I'm not an expert in this area, but seeing the visual language that you're using is, yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of advice you can give me as well.
Yeah, you could actually look at a paper that I've written on which I might be speaking a little bit further at the NCBS in March. Actually, it's on the story of it's called Indians Don't Like White Space.
Yes, I just saw it on the website that you
on the
showed.
website. Yeah. So I will be talking a little bit further on it, and in March if you're interested. But these sort of issues are things that are very, very critical, and I don't think they're addressed enough, because it's not just the matter of sort of the language itself, but it's also the sort of the form that the vernacular takes in different sort of spaces and communities and things like that. Because we presume that there is a universality in which the way in which communication is sort of delivered.
And sometimes you also might be reproducing the biases of the archive itself, right?
Sorry?
You sometimes might be reproducing the biases in terms of language, in terms of accessibility of the archive itself, from which it was created and when it started. So just being aware of that.
Yeah, I think, well, that is a generic sort of concern that should be looked at as archivists, when there is a sort of a bias that we all sort of come with, bias or sort of leaning or inclination, and we would be imposing our sort of own biases in terms of language and form.
All right. So, Tana, you go on, and then Shobhana, Rupal, Deepthi, and Avantika.
Okay. Hi, Sarita. My name is Tana, and I'm working with Avni for the Patni project.
Okay.
I teach at Ahmedabad University, and I have been teaching business history. So my question is, especially concerning the Godrej archives. I mean, I loved what you have done, and I always think that in the classroom, I need to get my students to actually look at the archives as a way in which they learn history, because especially when it comes to business history. So my question was, can you suggest ways in which the students, I mean, I'm not sure if it's something that I mean, it's largely to do with teaching, but because you also have so much of experience with Shrishti, what are some ways in which we can get students to actually engage more with archives? Engage not just in terms of looking at the archives, but also in terms of maybe adding something to the archives or engaging with them in a very active manner.
These are students of business histories.
Business history. So these are students largely from the management background or engineering. They come from varied backgrounds.
Got it. So management sort of backgrounds. Yeah.
Yes.
I think one way in which most businesses are interested at a very sort of broad level in looking at the archives, or should be interested, is because often the values of a company, or the brand values of a company, can be found deep down into the raison d'etre of their being, the sort of reason why they came to be. And that's often a founder's vision, that who would have a certain set of values. And I think from a management perspective, I imagine that management students would and should be interested in sort of looking at that, when they're looking at, say, joining an organization, what are the core values of what an organization is? And often those are found in the deep annals of the archives of a company. It could be in the spark that prompted them to start a company, for instance, or sort of a story that made them change the way in which they diversify or something like that.
Sure. A lot of students have their own businesses. They have family businesses. So I get them to actually look at their own family businesses and write about it. So,
yeah, I can imagine then that's a sort of if you maybe ask them to, or give them a set of questions, which is not directly go look at your archives, but sort of say that what is it that drives you, or sort of, what is it that prompted, or is there a story or something like that? And then that would provoke them to sort of look, I imagine, into what initiated something. Does that help?
yes. I mean, I'm also trying to figure out more ways to get them actually looking to examine the archives, but I think we can take it up later with more questions coming up.
Hi, Sarita. Shobna here.
Hi.
I'm came upon this accidentally, like my entire life in India, which has been an accident. I'm actually looking at women who love women. And the more I get into this learning about archives, I'm sorry, Ishita, I'm figuring out that the querying of the archive, the process doesn't work. Actually, when we're trying to record women who love women. And it's coming more and more that I probably will have to invest more financially in this project once I work at a later stage. What I'm trying to get to is, how does the finances work? Is nationally, I mean, India, I know, may not have funding available like out in the West for certain things. What's the funding situation for archives generally? I just want to have a general perception and then sort of filter down to what I would want funding for.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier to answer that question if I know, like, specifically what the project is at hand. Then I could sort of strategize in terms of.
I'm working in trying to visualize women who love women.
Okay.
Now, I started out with grand plan, and it's filtered down to now what may work is the mapping of it, because women also don't want to be identified. So how do I make it public? For example, with only the first name, where they were born, the process in brief, with not necessarily the picture, the facial picture,
yeah,
but a picture that represents queerness to them.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is a lot of querying of the process of archive, of how I get, of what information I get. Yeah. Now, for that, I thought I would go with Google Maps, but doing a lot of more research, I found that I probably will have to use much more sophisticated levels of internet or digital platform, because what other information is coming. One of the other things I wanted to do was make information available for the next generation of women who are exploring sexuality. Now that would mean that I would have to have certain information only accessible to a certain few people who are exploring. Mapping can be public, but intimate information, I mean, one thing is to put it out anonymously, but for me, that doesn't make sense if I want to visualize a certain population.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of debates either way, which is fine. So what I'm looking at is, if I want to put something on a digital platform with various levels of accessibility, what sort of funding and where would funding, or who would be interested in something like that?
So, I mean, I imagine we had done, there's another project that I worked on, which I haven't shared, which is, well, it's not sort of got to do with sort of specifically women loving women, but it was through the Zuban, you know, Zuban.
Yeah, of course, yes, yeah.
So Zuban, we had worked on a little book called Poster Women.
Yeah, postcards from feminism, yes.
Not postcards. This was, it's called Poster Women.
Poster Women, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So we'd sort of helped put together brilliant sort of work that was to do with mapping the history of the women's movement in India through TERRA. But I imagine that organizations like them, but there is another one, and I can't remember the name offhand, and they have online really brilliant articles on experiences of sort of women exploring sexuality, gender, all that sort of thing. I can't remember the name right now, but if I dig a little bit offline, I can find it and send it to you.
Is it Indian?
Sorry?
Is it Indian?
Yeah, it's Indian. It's Indian.
Oh, okay.
It's Indian, and it's very good writing.
Cool.
Extremely good writing. There are two sites that I know of, and they do talk a lot of about stories or experiences and stuff like that. And now whether they will get funding or not, I don't know, because these are all sort of initial. They're probably someone who's just put it out there. Zuban, I can imagine, might have access to funding. They themselves, I know, are not hugely, they eke out quite a difficult existence in whatever they do, but they might be a good set of people to tap. Offline, I can share with you some other contacts as well that I think might have leads. I myself don't have leads, but in terms of sort of
I'm sorry. No, I'm looking at a general perspective.
So, just as a general perspective, I think if you were to sort of look out for funding, it might be worthwhile that you create sort of phases in which, so that you can get general funding on this at a more historical level, and specific sort of things that are related to sort of gender, sexuality, all that sort of thing, like you say, would be a second level, just so that you might be able to broaden your funding sort of pool.
Okay, great.
So I could sort of later just text you a few people that I feel might be able to have leads. I myself, I'm not sure specifically, but I know because I've worked with a few of them that they might
great.
That you could follow.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Rupal?
Hi, Sarita. It was a very interesting presentation. My question is mainly more to do with the display part of the exhibition or the aids that one uses. This again comes from not just my archive which I'm building, but also for my workplace, where my role is mainly to deal with exhibition design and a bit of curation.
Where do you
I work with Kemol Prescott Road, the art gallery.
Yeah.
So in the last 3 years, I've had about 25 exhibitions. And what I've noticed is there was one particular exhibition which was from the Citizen Archive of India. If you heard of it.
Now
I noticed that no, not Pari. There's another one, CAI.
Okay.
Yeah. So they had a whole lot of oral history recordings and of course a lot of videos. These were mainly recordings of people in India who were born before independence. So their stories, Now what I noticed is, which I faced in my work also while designing exhibitions, is when there is just an audio or an oral history recording with no visual in front of them, the engagement was far lesser. Have you also faced this, and how have you in any way kind of resolved it, if at all?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. But there is one thing, and again, I don't have those visuals here, but I had shown them in another presentation, where I kind of, one thing that I noticed was the way in which the body of a visitor sort of responds to things like an audio versus a video versus, say, a panel. You know, there is
Right.
certain physical, if you look at the body, there's a slight difference. So you'll see that a body, and I don't know if you can see me right now, but
I can, yeah.
the panel, when you're looking at a panel, it's a little bit of like that, you know.
Right, right.
You know, you tilt your head and you look back. And then when
Yeah.
you're sort of listening to a recording, your body is sort of turned in and you're sort of looking down.
Right.
And then when you're looking at a video, there are obviously 2 or 3 sensory things at play. There's the audio as well as the video that's there at play.
Right.
But
Right.
and I was trying to see that whether these sort of body movements and you know, does the body then becomes as a receptacle for receiving information, and the postures which one adopts change the way in which actually you respond to it. I kind of was curious to sort of see that. I can't say that I have reached any definitive answers, but I do imagine, and I myself do not like, if I was a visitor, the pure audio thing. Like even when visiting museums abroad, I hate putting on the audio. For 2 reasons. One is that I feel it cuts me off from the rest, especially if you're walking around with a headphone all across an entire museum. And in some way, I do want to sort of respond to all the things that are there in the museum rather than that sort of focus thing. I imagine some people like that sort of focus as well. But I think when it is nuggeted and it's small, the audio works, especially for things like oral histories. And I know that I saw people who were listening very, very deeply to some of the oral histories in, say, the Godrej archives, because they wanted to know about how a particular factory worker answered a particular query about, say, his experience 30 years back. So when it is very, very specific, and it is, I think it works well. When it is used as a sort of holding thread throughout, I don't think it works as well, because it's just too long to be
exactly.
the environment.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was quite insightful and quite interesting. Thank you, Shobna. Sarita, sorry. Deepti, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarita. This is a real treat. I just loved all your work. The question that I had was about the volumes of information and raw material that one can gather. And really, is there...
Sorry, can you tell me?
I am a photographer. I studied electronics, but I do photography for a living. Not in the recent past, for the last 2-3 years, because I have a child now. And the volume of information that is available, whether it's even with Hottest Malabarika, whether Godrej, or even the women Patachitragalu, the Bhavachitragalu that you have, there's so much information that one can gather. But I know for each project it can be different, but what is a tool that you would more or less use to create the framework and then say, okay, this is enough and this is what I'm going to work with?
It's a very interesting thing, and I have to tell you this little story. So I had this intern with me, her name's Savitri, and she was just, actually she worked with me as well after her project, and she worked with me for the Mahila Bhava Chitragalu. She did her diploma project with me. And then soon after that, we worked on the Godrej Archives exhibition. So, we used to have access. I would go across to Bombay often, while she would sort of try and dig out information through the digital portal that was there. So I would give her sort of broad guidelines and say, okay, broadly, say values of Godrej or what they did, dig out information, right? And then, after a week or whatever, certain period, she would dig out a lot of information. And then she was just wonderful. She had, she put out lists and lists and into neat buckets. Great thing. And then it came to the point of where we had to sort of choose what we're going to present and how we're going to choose. So me and the designer I work with, Georgie, and we would sit together and we said, okay, so Savitri, we'll take 5 of these, and then that's what we're going to talk about. And she looked at me so angrily. She was upset with me because what happens, and I think this is very, very, I felt that even with other archivists, or, okay, Savitri was not an archivist, but she had grown to love the information so much. She was angry with me because I was distilling her 20 points to 5, and she said, but, that's also important. That's also important. So then I had to sort of explain to her that if I give a viewer 20 points, he's not going to walk away with those 20 points. There's no way that anyone coming to an exhibition or, a space, a book, whatever it is, and you're giving them 45 minutes to go through, they're not going to be able to walk away with those. You have to distill it to 5. And that was something that, for me, that whole experience and this anecdote sort of told me how actually it's difficult to let go. And I face that problem when I'm doing research myself. I don't want to let go, and then I need somebody else to tell me that I don't need those additional 5 points. I only need, these 5 points. So it's sometimes, I think, useful to share what you're doing with somebody else and to sort of distance yourself, which is not very easy. But like right now in this project that I'm working on, I'm trying to, I cannot move forward because I love every little bit of it. So, so it's useful when I sort of share what I'm doing with my editor or whoever I'm sort of showing, and they say, and then I see that they're concentrating on some things which are possibly more relevant. So maybe just sharing it is the way to.
So unfortunately here we have to we have to be the archivist as well as a curator. So
which is true, yes. Which is what I also face, which is why you have to then let go of it and give it to somebody totally distanced from the project, so that they will then cold-bloodedly tell you to let go, which is what I did with, say, Savitri, which I'm now asking someone else to do for me. So, it's ruthless, but
I think this is also the point which you agreed on, Sarita, before you left from conversation with Sophia as well, that this is the struggle that we go through between the researcher and the curator.
Yeah. And I think I can see a lot of people here sort of wear these multiple hats. So it's sort of difficult to decide at which point you wear which hat, So it's a sort of, I don't think I've done it successfully at every point, but it's just,
I think you telling us that also helps us. Yes. We know, okay, we can afford to struggle. Yes.
I'm struggling right now. I'm really struggling right now. I'm finding it difficult to move because I don't want to let go a lot of things, Yeah. And I get as upset as Savitri did with me when someone else tells me to go. So it's sort of part of the process, I think.
All right. So Avantika has questions. I think we could end with that. Avantika, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there, Sari.
Okay.
Hi, Sarita. I am a journalist and a researcher with this interest in oral history, and I am working on my, it's an interactive story that I'm trying to build around my grandfather, whom I never met. So the project is called Dear Grandfather, where there's this search around who he was, and also like understanding my family history through that search. I was just wondering that the problem that I'm that I face not just in this project, but it's one problem that always comes up is that which platform will justify this story the best, and how do you sort of make that decision? Because looking at your projects, you've done from books to physical museums to audios, recording oral histories. But how do you sort of make that decision? Is that made intuitively by looking at the material, or is it like a very conscious choice looking at how people would be able to access it, or and also like then the difficulty of, if it's a conscious choice, the difficulty of working on it, because if it comes intuitively to oneself. For instance, when I thought of the grandfather project, I thought of writing a memoir book, but now when I think of it, it's more like just a 15-minute audio story that I want to tell with some visuals and the physicality of the house that we lived in. So just the dynamics, wanted to understand from your perspective.
I think the first thing is like, which is the medium you're comfortable with, but are you more comfortable? I mean, that makes a huge difference. I mean, are you more comfortable telling a story in using film or print or space or audio, whatever else? So that, I think that's one point. And obviously the second is how you want to sort of disseminate this information through, so what is the audience, what is the medium that your audience is comfortable with? Maybe that answer should be, that question should be first actually, and the second later, because the second you can always get help for. I mean, you might say that, for XXX, the film is the best medium, and if I'm not a good enough filmmaker, then find a filmmaker, That's one way of sort of doing it. And sometimes possibly you need to use a combination of a couple of different platforms because the content itself demands a certain, the archival content might demand a particular platform which is more relevant than another. So when we, and then the third and fourth thing could possibly be the nature of the archival material. So for instance, when you were doing the Godrej archives, we had access to very good black and white images by an iconic photographer of 60s and 70s. Now the prints are, we wouldn't want people to sort of touch the prints, right? Because they're archival. And then the question was creating copies. But if you make a digital copy of what was printed, using the old sort of developer medium of black and white photos, you're not going to get the tactile nature of it. So then the compromise was, and then volume, we didn't have the space. So sometimes the platform is determined by how much physical space you have. So therefore, the digital medium sort of allows you within a smaller space to load a lot more things. So we had, what the solution we had was actually to use the Kindle to replicate these photographs. Of course, big prints condensed to the Kindle size. But one thing we decided was that while we were going to use the digital medium, we did not want to use a regular tablet, because the regular tablet had a sort of a sheen, it had a gloss, and these prints had a sort of a matte quality. And then we decided that the Kindle would be the answer. So we used the Kindle, and we had to crack the Kindle code, and my interactive person, she spent sort of a few hours trying to crack the Kindle and be able to sort of, because Kindle comes preloaded, right? So we had to sort of crack it and put it in, but she did that. And we felt a little bit satisfied that we used the Kindle, which had this matte quality, a little closer to a black and white print than if we had loaded it on. So there, these are the sort of different reasons why we might use a particular platform or media or sort of device as opposed to something else. Yeah.
Right. Just to add on to that, I mean, is there also some decision making or like a conscious choice that comes with, you know, using illustrations or comics, if in between, for instance, if there's some serious tone to the story, can you also show it through comics or through just illustrations or graphics that you know you showed us in a couple of your projects? And if yes, then how does that choice get made? Like, I'm just trying to understand, was it very intuitive for you in your own projects as well, or did you give like a conscious thought to how well it can be told?
I'm sort of recalling 3 of the projects where we've used sort of graphic storytelling using sort of visualized illustrations. One was, of course, when we did the landmarks in the history of sustainability. Just 4 spreads or so is what we used to tell the story of Chipko. We wanted to tell that as a story rather than as a sort of a report, because it had a storytelling character and because the visuals were so strong. And we actually recreated one of the very iconic images. I didn't show it, but the image of the women hugging the tree, for instance, you know, that we sort of visualized it. So in there, the choice was because it had a very strong storytelling sort of quality to it. In the case of the archivist story, we wanted to contrast it from the rest of the story. So there was a sort of a decision to sort of contrast it away from what it was. Sometimes, like in the case of the pastoralist story, again, when you the advantage of sort of graphic storytelling is that you can humanize certain things. So the fact that I could use characters and semi-fictionalize them, you start feeling a sort of connection. You know, it's like when you see a film and then you feel that the story, the person in the film is you. You know, you start sort of so that sort of is a device that's quite powerful sometimes when you use. The other is humor. I mean, you know, sometimes, and in one of the, I haven't shown you, when we did the thing on the iBook, we used, well, we didn't use an entire comic book, but we used a little story of the founder of this institute, the I Institute. Now, he just refused to get photographed. He says, you're not to photograph me. So then we had no other option but to sort of caricature him. And he was very caricaturable, which was useful. He wore, in the middle of hot Andhra Pradesh, he wore a polka-dotted bow tie. So we actually used a caricature of this man with a bow tie in the book. And it was, and luckily the man had a sense of humor and he didn't feel that, you know, we were making a sort of a caricature of someone who started this wonderful organization. And we called it The Man with the Bow Tie, you know. And so yeah, I mean, you know, it's a combination of different things that